Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted today to have a special guest as part of our Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth podcast series. We have with us Jeffrey Archer, as many of you will know, an English novelist, a former politician, a novelist whose books have sold over 320 million copies worldwide. He's widely celebrated as one of England's greatest ever authors. Jeffrey, it's an absolute honor to have you on our platform today. I want to start with how have you been the last year or so dealing with sort of COVID-19 lockdowns and all that sort of stuff?
Well, the truth is I'm in a very privileged position because the job I do, telling stories, lockdown is almost an advantage. So that in the 14 months of COVID, which has been a terrible 14 months, I have managed to write 2 books. Whereas I have a friend who owns an art gallery who hasn't had any customers coming through the door. I have a friend who owns a restaurant who's been closed for 14 months. And I realize I'm not a person who should be asked how it went, because although it's been boring at one level, I haven't had the problems that so many people have had. And I have such sympathy with those people. My son met a lady in the park the other day who said she lived in a high-rise flat. She was single parent, she's family. She lived in a high-rise flat with 3 children, 8, 6, and 4, and she was afraid. That was the word. So I've been very privileged, but I'm very aware of how many people in Britain had a very hard time. On top of that, Sunil, we are very conscious in Britain how bad it's been in India. We've been following the problem in India with great interest. I was glad to hear from a friend of mine in India 2 or 3 days ago, Anatab, that in fact things are improving and it is getting slightly better. But of course, it's still, because of the size of your population, a massive problem. And we in Britain are very aware of it.
Yes, I think COVID-19 has affected so many people in so many different ways. How has it been actually writing? You said that you've written 2 books. Has it made a difference to your sort of creativity? Has it been harder for you, easier for you? Because obviously initially the restrictions, we were allowed, we feel like, to leave the house like once a day. Did that have an impact for you, or was it just you were able to sort of just go through it all and it made things no distractions, if you like?
Not really, because I rise at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30. I rise about 5:30. I start work at 6. I write for 2 hours, and I then come back and have breakfast with my wife and a break for 2 hours. And I'm back on again at 10 o'clock for 2 hours. I then go for an hour's walk. Because of my age, I have to do 10,000 paces a day. And then I have lunch. And then I go back at 2 o'clock and do 2 until 4 and have another break. And then I read through what I've done between 6 and 8. Now, you live in a house. I have a little garden. I have an office where I work. I've been able to do that. On the creativity front, because the William Warwick series has been in my mind now for 4 years, and I'm very much living with William and with Beth, and they are part of my family almost. That's not been a problem. I've just moved on and on. In fact, I know, without any detail, I know the subjects of book 4, 5, 6, and possibly 7, because I've been sitting still, not doing much else. So even when I go for my hour's walk, the brain is on it as well.
That's incredible to hear about your routine. How long have you had that routine for? Is that something
from the beginning, young man?
Wow.
Routine's very important to me. I believe in hard work. I don't believe you get anywhere without hard work. And I have to say, of all the nations on earth, Indians are the most conscious of that. They're one of the hardest working people I've ever come across in my life. And you can see it in England very clearly, how many young Indians are coming through in medicine, in business, in finance, because not only are they bright, but they work very hard indeed. So I have to get up very early in order to beat young men like you.
It's funny mentioning Indians and stuff, because we've had we've talked a lot about sort of on our platform, the sort of changing, if you like, of the Conservative Party, and how it's wouldn't say it's necessarily become, well, you'd say it's more diverse, but there's definitely more Indians that are probably more vocal about being supportive of the Conservative Party, because often, you know, the argument is they actually do share very similar values in terms of the political organization. You could argue Labour are a bit better at accessing the votes than I suppose maybe in the 70s, 80s, but since then I think there's definitely been a real shift. I think one study that we saw recently was Indians, after white people, were the second most who voted for Brexit in 2016, and I think there's lots of other signs that we're seeing that they do align with the Conservative Party, which kind of leads me well on to your time in politics. We'll go back and
before you go on to that, young man, may I remind you that the Conservative Party was the first party to have a Jewish Prime Minister. The Conservative Party was the first party to have a woman Prime Minister. In fact, we've now had 2 women Prime Ministers. And I know you're going to talk about Ted Heath. So we were the first party to have a bachelor Prime Minister. And we've now got in the cabinet complete diversity when you see the amount of people who come from different backgrounds and their parents came from different countries. That's the Conservative Party. The Labour Party has always been far more conservative than the Conservative Party when it comes to that sort of diversity.
I think before we move to Ted Heath, I think that's a really interesting point you raised. I talked recently at Oxford University, and one things I was talking against the quota system, why I'm not a big fan of it, and I used our cabinet as a fantastic example. You know, you've got 3 British Indians in the cabinet who are there not by a quota system; they're there on merit. You know, they're 3, and what I love about all 3, they're all 3 very different profiles of people, different opinions. In Prithvi Patel, Rishi Sunak, and Alok Sharma, they don't necessarily prescribe to this idea of being on the left or in the middle, which is what often we tend to see. What was it like, going back, being an MP for Edward Heath, and more importantly, what was it like generally in politics during that era?
Well, you have to remember, I entered the House in 1969 at the age of 29. Looking back on it now, I'm not in any doubt I was too young. I have to say that if I could have life again, one of the few changes I'd make is I wouldn't enter the House until I was 40. Sajid Javid came to see me many years ago, long before he was in the House of Commons, and said he wanted to go in the House. And I said, don't make the mistake I made of going in too young and thinking you're ready. You're not. And he went back to Deutsche Bank and, as we know, had a brilliant and successful career, and went into politics not until he was over 40, and was in the cabinet within 3 years, because that's the modern way. That didn't happen in my day. You waited 10, 15 years before you got in the cabinet. That's all changed. Really able people can get through to these top places very quickly. So when you get a really good say Indian like our Chancellor of the Exchequer, everybody can see how good he is. You can't miss it. And frankly, I don't give a damn what color they are or what religion they are. I want my country run by the best available people.
Definitely, I think that's a sentiment on our platform. I think our organization definitely 100% believes, and I think it's just finding the best people for the right role. And if they happen to be Indian, they happen to be Indian. If they happen to be white, they happen to be white. If they happen to be women, they happen to be women. It's just about who is the best person for the role.
Well,
and I think sometimes
the point on that is that when we elected Margaret Thatcher, we elected her because she was the best person, and she turned out to be right. The Labour Party are now saying we've got to have a woman. That's absolutely wrong. You've got to have the best person. And if the best person is a woman, wonderful. But don't say, I've got to have this, I've got to have that. Get the best person you can lay your hands on.
I couldn't agree more. And I think in some ways it's almost degrading sometimes when the quota system and stuff like this. It's like, I fairly confident in myself, and I want to be selected on merit. I don't want to be in a job interview or in a political position because you need to fill an Indian on the list or a black. I'm confident in myself, and I don't want that.
I can see that. I can see that. You don't have to. Thank you very much indeed. Move on.
But no, let's talk about Edward Heath. So that was, you had him as you worked in his government. What was that experience like? And you said you were too young. What do you mean by that? Was it just not enough life experience, or do you just think things would have been different?
Life experience. Certainly not enough life experience, number one. And of course, in those days, there was terrible snobbery in England. And I certainly wasn't in what I call the correct set who'd been to Eton and done all those sort of things. So I was at a minor disadvantage because we were just about coming out of that ridiculous attitude. And now, of course, that's changed completely. We're much more of a meritocracy now than we were then. I never really got on to Ted Heath's wavelength. The Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, was a man I liked a lot more. I liked Harold very much, and we remained friends right through to his death. I thought he was a very clever politician, a very clever man, a very decent man, and I didn't hesitate to seek his advice and wisdom whenever I got the opportunity. And we both ended up, him way ahead of me, in the House of Lords when I think we became even closer. He had a pathetic attitude about Huddersfield football team, but otherwise he seemed to be a very sane and level person.
I think moving on nicely to Margaret Thatcher. You obviously worked with her for a considerable amount of time. We actually had Sir Malcolm Rifkind on our platform recently. And it was interesting hearing from him stories of his time with Margaret Thatcher. It's quite well known. I think they had a fairly frosty relationship, but I think one in which he really respected her. What was your relationship like with Margaret Thatcher? And
before I got my relationship, let me tell you about Malcolm. The Prime Minister rang me up and said to discuss the cabinet. And it was a sigh. She said, "It's going to be your friend Malcolm Rifkind who will be Secretary of State for Scotland." And it was clear she was not pleased about it, but she would have been the first to acknowledge that Malcolm was an extremely able man. And we were very privileged to have him running Scotland. Of course, he went on to become Foreign Secretary. He was a very formidable politician and a very considerable intellect he brought to the cabinet. In my own case, I was more of what I call a working horse who was involved in elections and trying to make sure that my Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and then later John Major, were returned to government. That was my job, and I reported back to Margaret Thatcher on what was happening in the country, what our chances were of winning that election, while she got on with governing the country and making things happen. Our relationship was very strong and became even stronger after she resigned. She was a close friend of my wife as well, for a different reason. My wife is chairman of the Science Museum. Margaret Thatcher read chemistry at Somerville College, Oxford. Many years later, my wife taught chemistry at Somerville College, Oxford. So they had that natural affinity. And all through those years, whenever they met, they would talk science, they would talk chemistry. So both of us had a particular relationship with the great lady. And I consider that to have been 11 of the happiest years of my life. And I consider it to have been a very great privilege to have served her in a minor capacity.
What do you think of Margaret Thatcher's impact in back then and today? Because one of the things I think we felt on this organization, generally we're all very big Margaret Thatcher fans. And sometimes I feel maybe with my generation in particular and younger, we don't necessarily appreciate the impact she had, whether it be on free market economy, capitalism, that kind of what she triggered in the 80s. And you could argue with Ronald Reagan in America as well. What impact do you think she's had in society today? And what was it like in the 80s when you had Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister?
Taking those as two questions, the first one, never a day goes by without Margaret Thatcher being mentioned in the press. Never a day goes by with her attitude to politics, her achievements, her beliefs in her economic strategy and schedules. Never a day goes by. So the answer to your question, Sunil, is she's had an immense influence on British politics. On your second question, what was it like working with her? We didn't know at the time quite what a giant she was. We had to lose her before we found out and look at the people who are currently governing our country. And so history has been very kind to her. She still has in Britain many enemies. She still has a group of people, particularly from the north of England, particularly from the mining community in Wales, who feel she deserted them and left them. And of course, we know what she hoped would be her biggest triumph, the poll tax, turned out to be her biggest disaster and brought her down. For example, I remember her, I was spending a weekend at Chequers with her, and she explained to me, and I'll never forget it, that if you had an old lady living in a large house and her husband had died, it was not right that she paid the same amount of rates as the house next door, who had a father and mother and 3 sons, 4 of them earning a living. She didn't think that was fair. And I remember when she explained it to me, I thought, wow, I went back that night in the car and thought, that's quite right. That's a wonderful policy. So I was in the same attitude that I thought this would actually win us the election. In fact, what they did, the Labour Party, was turn it into being called the poll tax. And it was a very clever line, the poll tax, and it harmed her greatly. The second idea the Prime Minister had, which I was again in favour of, she said, let's start in Scotland so that Scotland get the benefits first. So immediately we started in Scotland. The Scottish said, oh, you've picked on us. You've chosen us to be the guinea pigs. So we lost that little battle as well. And it was, I'm afraid, the beginning of the end. The truth is, though, that Margaret had served 11 years. Margaret Thatcher had served 11 years. And frankly, if you look at the American system, I think probably 8 years is enough for any one person to be governing their country. It's not that they go off, but they get tired and they get out of touch. You can't fail to get out of touch because you've got such pressures on you every single day while other things are going on. And I became very aware of that towards the end of her premiership, that I was telling her things that were going on out there in the country or in my own love of the theatre or something like that. And she clearly had lost touch at that level. So I think overall, though, one will look back on her period as an age when she took us out of our economic problems and showed us we could be a great nation. And I am very proud to have served her.
What do you think one of her best achievements was during those a time as leader?
Well, clearly the nation thought her attitude with the Falklands was a sign of how she felt about Britain as a world nation, and we weren't to be kicked about. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is she would tell you very firmly that we were in the doldrums financially when she took over, that we were not paying our way in the world and we were not held in high regard. And she would say at the end of 11 years, we had a strong financial position and respect throughout the world. Now, neither of those two extremes are wholly accurate, but she'd have every right to say that she played a major part in putting us back on the financial map and indeed guiding people towards believing the importance of self-sufficiency, the importance of earning your own living. She was always very proud of a small company that had started with nothing and not become a giant company. They're rare. Become a medium-sized company that was employing 300 people and doing a good job. Nothing gave her greater pleasure than when she traveled around the country, someone saying, well, you know, Prime Minister, I began my company 20 years ago. We had 12 people. I'm now employing 300 people, and we do X, Y, and Z. That really what made her feel that's what I want in life. And of course, there were those people who went on to become giants because of the freedom they had under her regime. And if you believe in a democracy, and if you believe in capitalism, if you believe in them, then you have to say she was wonderful. Or the other extreme, of course, is if you believe in communism, and you believe we are all born equal and should be equal under any circumstances, that's the other extreme. And she didn't believe in that. I've never believed in equality. I have always believed in equality of opportunity. Give everyone a chance to prove, wherever they come from, whatever they do, a chance to prove the thing they want to do in life. Give them a chance to make it a success. There are lazy people. There are people who work very hard indeed. And there's the in-betweens. But don't level society so that it's unattractive to work. People, you can't just not work. You pay your taxes, work hard, and she felt that's what she wanted to achieve.
I want to touch on the self-accountability aspect there. Do you think is that a concern for you going forward in 2021? Now, my argument to this is, of course, in the last 18 months, we've had this dangerous virus that has impacted millions of people's lives. There is the argument to say we have given state a lot of power in the last 18 months, which isn't unlike normal sort of conservative philosophy. Do you think there's a bit of a concern now that as we're moving away, hopefully, and we're going back to a normal society, if you like, do you think that's a potential concern where people are now used to the sort of intervention from state and support from state, and we could go down almost the opposite to what sort of a Margaret Thatcher would want in terms of that self-reliance? Or do you think it's just the phase that we've had in this period of time and we'll go back?
It would have been fascinating to see, and we will never know how different it might have been if Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister now and not when she was. We all discuss that. It's fascinating, of course it is. But the truth of the matter is, Sunil, we've just going through the Third World War. Every country on earth involved. So it's a real world war. And the world war has been against COVID-19. And some countries have done better than others. And everyone's been involved. So when you say, and I can see where you're coming from, are the Conservative Party now not that the party of the safe money and safety and being careful? We couldn't be. We were in a world war. And in a world war, you will face tremendous financial problems. Not just us, the United States, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, in our own European look. And I'm sure it's true in India as well. So it would be fascinating to know how Margaret would have handled that. But let's kid ourselves. This has been the Third World War.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that. We will come back to politics. I want to move to your writing. And let's go back right to the start. I've literally just finished your first book that you ever wrote, and it was an incredible read. I'm not normally a huge a fiction fan. I love reading non-fiction, but obviously the Clifton Chronicles is just I think that's just almost part of our tradition to read it. You've got to do it. But how did it start for you, the writing aspect? I've read that it was almost out of necessity. Is that true, or was it?
It's a strange way of putting it, and may I thank you now, aged whatever you are, poor little thing, that I wrote not a penny more, not a penny less, 50 years ago. You know, you weren't even born. And what's thrilling for an author, and I mean thrilling, is that you, Sunil, are reading it now. That for an author is thrilling, because that makes me believe when I've left this earth, your children will be reading the books. Well, you say necessity, an interesting word. I left the House of Commons in terrible debt, facing bankruptcy. Thank heavens never went bankrupt. Sat down and wrote that first book, not a penny more, not a penny less. And in hardback, it sold 3,000 copies. Well, I was in debt for £400,000. So selling 3,000 copies is not exactly going to make a very big dent in 400,000. Second book did okay. My wife wasn't sure whether I should go out and try and get a proper job. The second book was okay. It sold 8,000, but the breakthrough was Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel sold 1 million in the first week and has now been read, according to the Indian Times, has been read by 100 million people in India. I mean, that's a frightening figure. I don't know if I believe it, but it's a frightening figure, because you've been one of the top countries for me, but I can't meet an Indian on the street who doesn't say he's read Cain and Abel. So that changed my whole life completely. Now, where I got lucky, Sunil, is I found something else I could do. So I fulfilled Proust's saying that we all end up doing the thing we're second best at. So I was given another chance. I was given this opportunity to tell stories. And of course, I've been shocked by how many million people have read them and the way it changed my whole life. So I'm very grateful. And I have to say to you, very fortunate and very lucky indeed, because I am first and foremost a storyteller. A writer, there are a lot of writers. Storytelling is a God-given gift. You can't pop down to the local supermarket and buy a packet of storytelling. It's a gift.
It's funny you mentioned Cain and Abel. My dad was in India when that came out, and he had read it, and he had read it in India, and hence why I ended up reading your books later on. But yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the readership you have in India. Going back to your first book, is it true that it was inspired from your own events? Did that play a part in it?
Oh, yes, very much. I had lost all my money, and I thought it was quite a clever idea that 4 young men who'd lost all their money in different fields, one was a doctor, one was an art dealer, one was an academic, the 4 young men lost their money and they had to steal it back from Mr. Big, but they mustn't steal more than had been stolen from them. They had to steal to the exact penny what he'd stolen from them. That was the challenge, or that was the fun of making the book. And I thought it was a clever idea. 14 publishers turned the book down.
Oh, wow.
The 15th publisher published, as I said, 3,000 copies. And so I always say to young authors, don't give in. J.K. Rowling, I think, had more turn downs than I did. Freddie Forsyth, certainly, with The Day of the Jackal, had as many turn downs as I. So don't despair. If you've written a book and you really believe in it, don't despair. But as I say, the breakthrough was the 3rd book, Cain and Abel, and since then it just hasn't stopped.
Is that your favorite book from? I know you've got new books coming out, which I'll try and push you on. But would you say Cain and Abel is your favorite book?
Certainly in the view of the public, absolutely no doubt in the view. I think A Prisoner of Birth, and I think also Paths of Glory, the story of Mallory. Was he the first man in 1924 to reach the top of Everest? We know they found his body 700 foot from the top. Was he on the way down or was he on the way up? The critics have said that's my best book. The people have said Cain and Abel, but I also love A Prisoner of Birth.
Right. I mean, you've got a huge readership base. How do you deal with that pressure now when you're writing? Do you not think about it? Is it just you get in your own zone, or are you thinking of what your readers want from your books?
No, you mustn't do that. Oh, I've got to have more sex. Oh, I've got to have more violence. Oh, I've got to have more bad language. Don't do it. Do what you feel good with. Write the book you want to do and pray the public will enjoy it and want it. Don't get into fads. Ghost stories are in this month. Don't do it. So I tell a simple story from beginning to end, and I try and make you turn the page. I try and tease you. I try and have twists and turns, and I try and, like you, make the people in my books, or hate them, one of the two. But no, under no condition do I look at what is in at the moment, fashionable. I go on, and it's now been 45 years, and I'm incapable of suddenly changing because the world has changed.
That actually leads on to my next question. Has your style changed much over the last 50 years in terms of the way you're writing, or not really?
Not as a storyteller, because Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less is still the favorite of many of my fans. So clearly not as a storyteller. I'm a better craftsman. I've written 27 books. I'm better at it now. If you believe the Americans' philosophy of the 1,000 hours, and you begin to get a little better. When I start a new book, I don't have all those things I worried about and wondered about in the first 3 books. I now have been through all that, done all that. My worry now is the story good enough? And if that stops and the sales go down, I'll stop. Truth is that with William Warwick, the sales have shot up. So they very kind of you to mention the Clifton Chronicles, but the William Warwick books are doing better than the Clifton Chronicles.
Wow. Okay.
So no, I won't be stopping in the near future, Sunil.
Well, that's great to hear. I mean, it's interesting. What I love about your books is when you talk to different Jeffrey Archer fans, everyone seems to have a different kind of favorite. Like the ones you've mentioned you've not mentioned the ones that I like the most. So I think that the Fourth Estate was one that I particularly enjoyed. I enjoyed, to be honest, even the 11th Commandment and the Last of the Cain and Abel one, which was Shall We Tell the President? They were the ones for me which I enjoyed the most, and you've not mentioned those ones. And I think what I always liked about your
before you say that, Son, that for me is wonderful, because so many authors, and you can name them, I can name them, have one book to their name, or maybe a second.
Yeah.
But the fact that I've already talked about the 4 or 5 I really care about, and you say no, there's 3 that I care. That's very flattering, and I'm very touched, because that shows that the storytelling has gone right through.
I mean, I think what I've always liked about your books is, and I know there's so many people that are similar, there is a relatability. I think often in your books, you will think that could be you, or in your first one, Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less. It's
You've all
crazy
lost
because that's
money.
your oldest.
Yeah, you've all lost money. You've all made fools of yourself, and you think, how did he get out of it? You're quite right.
And exactly that. And it's really strange because although that's your first book, that's one of the most recent books I've read of yours, and it's definitely up there with one of my favorite of your series for sure. Let's talk a bit about the William Warwick series. What inspired that? What started that this sort of new series that you were going to go for? And are we going to be seeing, I know there's a book coming out in October 21. Will we be seeing this continue? Are we going to see it carry on like we saw with the Clifton Chronicles for?
The Clifton Chronicles is a series. This is not a series. Each book is individual. It's the story of William Warwick, who leaves school and wants to join the Metropolitan Police. But his father, a distinguished QC, wants him to go to Oxford and read law and then join him in chambers. But he defies his father and becomes a copper on the beat in London. And that's book 1. And you see him in his first role as a constable, where he joins the Art and Antique Squad. So the answer to your question, Sunil, is you are going to see him, and this is in my mind, you're going to see him. Every book will be a story in its own right, but he will have risen in rank. So book number 1, he's a constable. Book number 2, he's a detective sergeant. Book number 3, he'll be a detective inspector. Book number 4, he'll be a detective chief inspector, which is the one that's coming out in October. But number 1 was art. Number 2 was drugs. Number 3 was police corruption. And number 4 is murder. So every book has its own story, and he just rises up in ranks. And my aim always when I sat down and started this was to go from constable right the way through to commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. But, Sunil, I have to live to the age of 85. Now, I've no doubt in my mind he is well capable of being the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, but I have to hope I'll be allowed to live to 85.
Oh, I'm sure you will be, and I'm really, yeah, I'm excited to be to actually really go into that the William Warwick series. I'm still I actually particularly enjoy your I think the sort of one-off novels. I think one that, again, we haven't talked about was Paths of Glory, which I absolutely love. But I want to actually, I was going to ask this question a bit later on, but we've had someone ask this question, and it's one that our viewers did email across, which was about your short stories. We saw you write, I mean, they're quite sporadic, it seems, the short stories that you've done in time. Are we going to be seeing more short stories from you?
Well, I've written 92 short stories, and I've quite recently asked the public to choose their favorite 20. And my publishers brought out a beautifully illustrated book called The Short, the Long, and the Tall, which showed what the public thought of the top 20. And in fact, I can say to you, Sunil, that was the one thing that I missed in COVID. That was the one thing that went badly wrong. Because I travel a lot, because I love people and I love listening to stories, I've had no short stories for 14 months. I hadn't realized I was out at lunch today and picked up a short story at lunch today. And I hadn't realized that when I was out chatting to people, seeing people, listening to people, but I was having lunch today with a very senior executive at Sotheby's auction house in London. And he was telling me a story about a particular painting and its whether it was real or whether it wasn't. It was a marvelous story. And I saw immediately how I could twist it and turn it and use it. But because I've been locked up for 14 months, I haven't had any short stories. Now, that may be a good thing because I've had to concentrate on the William Warwicks. I've had to concentrate on getting that family into my mind, the villains, Miles Faulkner and his wife, Christina, the heroes, William and his wife, Beth, and Ross, Inspector Ross, and how he can, in 24 hours, change everything despite what William has wanted. So that's been the challenge in the last 14 months. I'm enjoying. I've been to the restaurant now with friends 3 times in the last 4 days. So I'm enjoying that intercourse very much indeed. And that's what I most missed. That and my hobby. I'm a charity auctioneer, and I love doing, and I've done several for Indian charities. I love doing charity auctioneering. And I haven't done one now for 14 months. So that's the other thing that COVID has stopped me doing.
In terms of sort of short stories, and it kind of leads on to another question I actually had for you. What are your what are your favorite books that you've read in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, in both short stories and normal books? Both, bit of both, if you like. Which ones have really had?
Well, short stories. I think Arcane Naran is as good as anyone we have in this country. I think he's a brilliant storyteller, and I think Moguldi Days is a masterpiece. He should have won the Nobel Prize for Moguldi Days. That was a masterpiece. I think H.H. Munro, known as Saki, was a brilliant. If your people watching this haven't read H.H. Munro, he's a wonderful short storyteller. I would say O. Henry, the American, Maupassant, the Frenchman, Somerset Maugham, an Englishman. But that's all. It's people don't do it much nowadays. You don't get short storytellers the way we had them when I was a child. And of the novels, my hero is unquestionably Stefan Zweig, and his novel Beware of Pity I consider a masterpiece. And he has that genius of combining great authority in writing with great storytelling. He's that rare, you get it once in a generation. And Stefan Zweig is it, although he only wrote 2 novels, and tragically, because he thought Hitler was going to win the war, tragically committed suicide. So we only have 2 novels to read. His non-fiction on Europe is staggering and acknowledged by every great academic as essential reading. So he would be my hero at that level. And I try to learn from him. I learn from him by just reading him.
Right. What about in terms of recent, let's say last 5-10 years? Are you still sort of, what kind of books do you read? What's your go-to? Do you have a specific genre? Or?
I've read in the last 2 or 3 years are Gentlemen in Moscow by Emon Towles. I thought that was a beautifully written book, and such a clever story, such a clever idea of a man who knew Lenin but was an aristocrat, and Lenin couldn't kill him because he liked him too much. So he puts him in a hotel, and what happens to him when he can't get out of it? He's stuck in one of the best hotels in Moscow. He can't get out, and you follow his life. I thought that was brilliant. I also very much liked The Tattooist of Auschwitz. It's the truth of the story that I found fascinating. How much he added or embellished the man, not the lady author, we don't know, and we never will know. But the idea of being the man who put the tattoos on you and his viewpoint of what happened in Auschwitz is, I thought they were my 2 good reads of the year.
Right.
But I'm a huge fan of a man called C.J. Sampson, who writes books about Henry and Elizabeth through his lawyer, Shardik, who was absolutely wonderful. So I think he's a great novelist and a great read too. He writes beautifully. So he has that combination. So I'd say over the last 5 years, those are the people I've truly enjoyed. To get a book that makes me jump up and down is pretty rare nowadays. People ring me all the time saying, you should read this, Jeffrey, you should read that. And I do. And I often don't get beyond page 20 or 30, even when they've hit the #1 on the bestsellers list. But occasionally, like Gentlemen in Moscow and The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and anything Stefan Zweig's read, I'm there. It's wonderful. It's a real privilege to read them.
Do you read much non-fiction at all? Is it largely fiction you read?
Mainly for research, though I've always believed you've got to talk to real human beings with research. I have on my team Detective Chief Superintendent John Somerville and Detective Sergeant Michelle Roycroft, both retired after distinguished careers in the Metropolitan Police Force. And they read my books at a late stage and tell me, that just can't be done. Yeah, that's fine, but you could add that. So they're there to make sure I don't make a fool of myself. But they also give me books to read. So if I'm doing one on drugs, I'll read nonfiction stuff about drugs. If I'm doing one on art theft, I will read books about people who've stolen great masters. For that, I read, of course, the amazing case of the art gallery in Boston, where those people walked in and took out 20 of the finest paintings in the world, and they've never been seen since. So yes, the research will be books that are related to what William Warwick is doing. And sometimes a line comes up. I remember going back, if I may, I remember vividly with Paths of Glory that you mentioned, in a book written by Audrey Selcom, a non-fiction book on Everest, and she was considered to be the leading authority on Mallory and on Everest. She wrote a sentence about that he was in love with 2 women, one his wife, Ruth, and the other a mountain called Cholamonga. goddess mother of the earth. And I saw the whole novel then. Here is a man in love with two women. That's the story. She gave it to me in one sentence, and then my weird brain set off in the direction of this man and the way he thought.
Interesting. The reason I actually thought that, because I've read the Tattoos in Auschwitz, and I also read Man's Search for Meaning, which was an incredible book of what happened in Auschwitz. One of the I don't know if you've read it, one of the survivors of Auschwitz. So that's kind of where I got that from. Again, I think we briefly discussed this off air. Somebody I think we both share a lot of mutual admiration for is Thomas Jefferson. What is it about him that you like so much, and why you admire him as one of the sort of amazing people that's lived throughout history?
Well, I have a passionate love of American politics. I was at Oxford at the time of the death of John Kennedy, and it had a great influence on my life in the sense that I really did think in my youth he would change the world. I thought if we had 8 years of him as president, the world would be a better place. And you think like that when you're a young student. And I have no regrets about thinking about that. But in history, in my love of reading about American presidents, another area in which I do read nonfiction, I think Jefferson is my biggest hero. The Americans have produced some amazing presidents. Jefferson and Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy. I mean, they've produced some amazing presidents. And at the beginning of their life, when there were only 13 states and they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were the most intellectual people in the United States. And when you have intellectual people in the United States, they're more intellectual than any of us. I mean, they are the great intellects in politics have been in early history of the presidency. John Adams, Jefferson, and the son of Adams, John Quincy, the two Roosevelts. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was writing amazing books at the same time as standing for president of the United States. They're a real polymath, and you need a polymath for that job. And I think what has been disappointing recently is that it's been a long time since we've had a president that the whole world says, wow, he or she is a bit special. And when I say she, may I remind you politely, Sunil, that I wrote The Prodigal Daughter, the sequel to Cain and Abel, in which Florentina Cain becomes the first woman president of the United States. I wrote that book 30 years ago, and still the Americans haven't had a woman president of the United States. And do you really believe in your heart there isn't a woman in America more impressive than Biden or Trump or Carter or any of them? There must be out there a giant woman who won't go into politics.
It's fascinating. I mean, American politics, we actually had Robert Zulik on our platform. He's been on our platform a couple of times, and he wrote America in the World, a history of US diplomacy and foreign policy. And he essentially, the book is just short abstracts of, in his opinion, his favorite sort of American presidents, ones that he believes had the biggest impact. So we had Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Ronald Reagan, and a number of other people in this book, which was really, really fascinating. In terms of American politics right now, I know it technically doesn't cover the Commonwealth, but you could argue outside the Commonwealth, it's probably the country that's.
I hadn't realized that America was part of the Commonwealth. I'm learning every day, Sunil, and it's very kind of you. I hadn't realized that America was part of the Commonwealth, but I'll take the question.
More for our listeners, just in case. What do you think of the state of US politics right now? It's something that seems very polarized and it's hard to really judge what's really going on. What do you see as a state of what's going on in America at the moment?
Very sad. I think Mr. Trump has done genuine damage to democracy. not least, just take one example, not acknowledging when you've lost by 7 million votes and you've lost the Electoral College by the number he lost it, that you don't acknowledge it, behave with dignity, turn up for the inauguration of the new president and bow out quietly. But he wasn't that sort of man. And we've somehow got to build back and get back that, I mean, I ask serious American analysts, politicians, senators, do you think that Trump actually believed he won the election? And most of them say, yes, Jeffrey, he's convinced himself he did. Well, I've been in politics all my life. I know when I've lost. When we lost to Harold Wilson, we only lost by 4 seats. And actually, we got more votes than the Labour Party. But I immediately acknowledged that Wilson was Prime Minister. And I would sit in the House of Commons in the opposition. And if you can't acknowledge that, you're not in a democracy.
I think that leads on to, I think, the UK, the UK state of politics. What do you think of the current Conservative government and how they've been in the last few years?
Well, everybody's going to look back on COVID with different views and attitudes. And it is very, very simple to say, oh, well, I would have done this. And if I'd been Prime Minister, I would have done that. And of course, they missed that. It's so easy to say, and it's rubbish. That you're thrown in with whatever problems you've got at that time, and you have to deal with them sometimes at a moment's notice, and you make mistakes. Of course you do. We had a bad start over deaths and over care homes. There's no doubt about that. But our vaccine program has been the equal, if not better than anyone in the world. We have led the world. I always say, it's a thing I say regularly now, if I was a German, a Frenchman, a Spaniard or an Italian, I would say, why are those bloody Brits? And why have they vaccinated more people than us? And a lot more people than us. Why? So there's been good and bad. But I think I take my wife's attitude on this. We'll know much better in a year's time when it's been properly considered, because it's very easy for Mr. or Mrs. Hindsight to give their opinion. So I'm not willing to join in that particular game.
I totally agree with you on it. We've had a few politicians on our platform, and it's a similar sort of thing. I think when it's such a unique set of circumstances, I think it's almost, we're sadly, unfortunately, it's trial and error, and it's unfortunate, it's with people's lives, but it is essentially such a something that we've not seen before. And I think it's too simplistic to make judgments of this person's done something good. I think we've all had to suffer. We suffered, India's suffering now, France suffered during a period, the States suffered. And I think it's only right that in a year's time, when we have we properly analyze what we did well and wrong, and we learn from this, I suppose, in the futures kind of take. My question was more towards the gen. I think if we go before COVID, so if we talk about the Conservative government prior COVID, and the leadership of Boris Johnson, do you think we're in a good state as a Conservative Party? Do you think this is a strong government that has legs to continue to win elections?
I think the sad thing is, yes, I think we will continue to win elections. I think the sad thing is we have no serious opposition. A democracy is based on a good opposition. A democracy is based in the House of Commons, tussling, fighting, and working it out. At the moment, the Labour Party in the last by-election just held, the Conservatives lost by 8,000 to a Liberal, but the Labour Party got 662 votes out of 50,000. So, I mean, they're just not even in the game. And next week we have Batley by-election in England, which is in theory a safe Labour seat. If they lose that, when we're in this situation, I mean, I don't know where the Labour Party is going to go. And I think it's probably unfair to say they need a new leader, because I think Sir Keir Starmer is a very fine man, very decent man, very caring man, and would make a good Prime Minister. But his party is torn apart after the departure of Corbyn. And we always think, well, I heard people say, well, now Corbyn is gone, the Labour Party will quickly get back into wanting to win elections. Not much sign of it at the moment. And so Boris Johnson, in a way, it falls into the category of Napoleon's comment of lucky generals. He is a lucky general. He's on the battlefield at the right time.
No, I think, sorry, I think the connection sort of cut off there. I think it's an interesting comment about Boris and Napoleon. Do you think, so, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, I think his impact is still there. I think there's still some the politicians who go with that sort of far left approach. Do you think that's what's damaging the party now, that far left wing of the Labour Party?
If they get rid of Keir Starmer, if next week's by-election is a disaster, and they get rid of Keir Starmer, my view is they will replace him with someone in the left again. The Labour Party hate to admit that Tony Blair won 3 elections in a row by standing on the centre ground, holding the socialist values, but standing on the centre ground when it came to the economy. They hate it. He's booed at the Labour Party conference when his name comes up. Wait a moment, he won 3 elections in a row. So I often say to my dedicated socialist friends, do you want to win the election? And one or two of them says, it's much more important to be right, Jeffrey, than win an election. Well, that's a wonderful attitude, and I admire it. But I actually am in politics to win elections.
I think it's bizarre. I think probably Tony Blair gets more respect at the moment, probably from the Conservative Party than he has from the Labour Party, which is
Margaret Thatcher held him in great respect. She was she felt he I mean, she hated socialism in every form it was, but she thought if you had to have a British Prime Minister who represented the Labour Party, I think Attlee, Wilson, and Tony Blair, they were not extremists of any type.
No.
And if the Labour Party is foolish enough to elect another extremist, they can shout at me as much as they like. They can tweet as much as they like. They can grumble as much as they like. They won't win the election. They have to capture someone who will bring home 41% of the vote. Because if you don't get 41% of the vote, you don't govern. So if you've got 30% who passionately believe you're right, but you never govern, you'll never make changes. And you have to get into power to make changes.
You touched on it there, and it's something that we regularly talk about on this platform, which is the influence of social media and the internet in general. In the last, you probably said the last 10 years in particular, where social media has clearly been growing. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question to normally when we have politicians on the platforms. I'm going to ask it about your books. Has social media and the internet had any impact on the way you write your books, or has it made any sort of difference at all?
No, partly because the books, as you know, the William Warwicks are set at the moment, they've reached 1990. So no, right. I'm not really caught up with it. And even when he becomes commissioner, I think it'll only be about 2010 when he becomes commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. So no, that hasn't affected me in any way at all. I haven't written, I mean, if you look at the novels, none of them are what I would call contemporary and right up to date. And I'm not sure, to be honest, Sunil, I'm not sure I'm capable of doing it, because I'm a bit of an old fogey, and I write these stories which I hope people like turning the page and enjoy the story. And I'm not really into the new generation. How could I be? How could I possibly be? So you'll have to wait for younger novelists to give you that. So it hasn't really affected me in any way. But if you look at Agatha Christie, who is one of the most successful novelists my country's ever produced, she couldn't write any of her novels today. She'd write novels, by the way, because she was a brilliant storyteller. But DNA would spoil every one of her novels. They would finish her novels, but she was clever enough. She'd be a modern crime writer. She'd get round that. And her other trick of having everybody in a room and then Poirot telling you who did the murder. She couldn't do that nowadays because everybody says, I'm not going to say a word until I've spoken to my lawyer. So you move with the times. So the answer to your question is, I can't go up there where you are discussing. I don't really understand it, and I'd be foolish to pretend I do.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps things up. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on our platform, and hopefully sometime soon we actually be able to do this in person, and it would be fantastic for you to be back on our platform. I'm sure there's so many more questions I'd love to ask you, and to continue this conversation. But thank you for your time today. It's been very interesting, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much indeed, Sunil, and may I also thank the Indian people as well, because everyone knows of my affection for the Indian people, unless we're playing a cricket match at Lord's, in which you're hammering aside and get a little bit irritated. But other than that, I love the people, love the country. I've missed not being allowed to go during COVID, and I look forward to coming back. My recent trip when I attended a wonderful festival, great privilege, where 7,500 people turned out to see me. I burst into tears. I was so touched by it. So I have this affection and love of the Indian people. So it gives me a chance, Sunil, to say to you, thank you very much for conducting this interview. And to your people, thank you very much. And I do hope, God knows I hope, that you will come through COVID as quickly as possible, and other nations will have the sense to make sure you get the vaccines you need.
Perfect. And yeah, thank you again for your time, and hopefully I'll see you at the cricket in a couple of months now, I think.
Correct.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and this recording will be out soon, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.